Chapter 5 Living Reflection from a Dream. March 28th. Remus woke up unusually warm. Burning up, really. The first thing he could feel was his hair sticking to the back of his neck, slick with sweat. He brought a hand up, trying to rub the sleep from his eye, but found he had to yank harder than usual to untangle his arm from where it was under Sirius's head. He blinked a few times, looked through the curtains, and saw it was already midday. He watched as a few people got into a car outside, turning up the radio before driving off. Remus sighed and propped himself up, then froze, fingers barely grazing Sirius's arm where he was draped over him. He was sleeping facing the other direction, back curled into Remus's, and he could feel every breath Sirius took as it pressed him further into the front of him. He didn't know where to look first, what to take in first. From his angle, it was either the way he could see the few strands of hair stuck to the side of Sirius's face, or the feeling of his skin against his own. So fucking warm and soft, and he didn't dare peel away from him. He was asleep. Sirius's hands were curled under his head, one knee thrown over the other. It was something innocent, sweet, and precious. Remus could see Sirius's tattoos, stark in contrast against the plain white comforter, and he longed just to touch them. He knew he could, but he wanted to touch them, with meaning more than just in an inquisitive way. Rough touches, squeezes, and grappling. He wanted the ability to run his palm over the curve of Sirius's shoulder, to grip him tightly and do what he pleased. Remus longed for the ability to have him, wholly and in whatever way he wanted, to where Sirius was his, and he could smother him in his entirety. Remus wiped the sleep from his eyes, taking one more second to appreciate and memorize the feel of being curled up with Sirius before throwing himself back and shutting his eyes tight. He was still for a moment before deciding, fuck it. Remus rolled over, gently throwing his arm over Sirius's side, and tucked his head into the pillow where Sirius's hair was tangled. He inhaled, and it was intoxicating. Scratched against his face, tickled his nose, but it was all inviting, the illusion of a home and somewhere to rest your bones. Sirius smelled warm and sweet, and Remus could almost taste the lingering hints of southern cuts and everything he had missed. And he just wanted to never move in his entire life, because if that was the case, at least he had this. He'd gladly give up the rest of his life to sink into the mattress and fucking decompose there if he got to hold Sirius a bit tighter at some point. If there were even a chance, Remus would take it. He tilted his head down, feeling Sirius's hair brush against his lips, and it was like a little bit of heaven he was stealing that fine morning. His mind drifted to a faraway place where it was always like this, where he could wake Sirius up and Remus would get a kiss in return. Just a kiss. He'd never ask for more if he could have that, even just once. If you're trying to fuck me, you're going to need to shift down a bit, Moons. Your trajectory is off, Sirius mumbled, and Remus's eyes went wide. He didn't dare move, holding his breath as Sirius chuckled and scooted forward, turning to look back at Remus. Remus grit his teeth, bracing an arm against the shower wall. He dropped his forehead to the cold tile with a loud thud before pausing, glancing behind him where the shower curtain was drawn and blocking the bathroom door. Eyes squeezed shut, he was trying to drown out the sound of Sirius singing in the room while getting ready for the show. Remus's mouth dropped open, and a gasp caught in the back of his throat as he gripped his cock harder in his hand. The summer before, Sirius had left. Don't play, Moons. You know you want it. Making him eat his words, Sirius begging on his knees. Crawling. Remus nodded to himself, letting his shoulders drop against the tile now, the cold grounding him for a brief moment in time, and the scalding hot water bringing him back as it roughly hit his skin. That time they had gotten too drunk on Christmas, the first time Remus's parents had left him alone for the holidays. I can think of a handful of things I'd like to do with you. Sirius had said it with a smirk after Remus had asked what he wanted to do for the break. I want to throw you against the counter and fuck you until you're crying, Remus would have said now. He stifled a gasp, moving his hand faster, facing the shower, and fumbling to turn the water hotter. The time Sirius had dried his pants, and had worn them anyway. The way they hung low on his hips, and Remus had spent the entire day begging God for a chance to bite those fucking hip bones at some point in his life. Sirius's voice was soft, coming from the other room, drowned out by the shower, but Remus could still hear him, could still imagine the smirk on his lips as he sang, and he thought of those lips. Wrapped around his cock, Remus pressed his face against the shower, mouth opening in a silent gasp as he let the water run over him, trying its hardest to wash away every evil thought he had ever had about the man in the other room. It would never be able to. He tore himself away from the wall, pressing his back against it, and sped up, frantic now as his mind overtook and the water had no chance of washing away every little situation and fantasy Remus had ever had. Sirius pressed against the wall, his neck that always looked so fucking soft beneath Remus's grip as he snapped his hips against Sirius's ass. Sirius's sly grin before Remus shoved his hands into his hair and pulled, forcing him to look back as he spouted every horrible thing he wanted to do to him. Sirius's mouth parted as a whimper escaped. Remus brought his arm up, biting the tender skin on top of his hand as he felt his release begin to splinter somewhere deep down. Sirius's long hair falling over his shoulder, sitting on his knees before Remus, squeezing Sirius's cheeks between his fingers before his hand came up, wrapping around Remus's cock. Heavy panting, swallowed moans, fingernails biting into skin, bruises and marks and fingerprints permanently on Sirius's fucking skin every day of his life because Remus could never get enough, and he was his and only his. "Mooney!" Sirius yelled from the other room, and Remus's eyes rolled back. Sirius's eyes wide as he came, brimmed with tears, gasping and fucking begging. Remus came with a groan, muffled from where he was biting into his hand. It fucking hurt, but fucking hell, it felt good. Sirius yelled his name again as he tried to catch his breath, and Remus lolled his head against the shower wall, roughly wiping the water from his eyes. "What?" he yelled back before clearing his throat, voice thick. "It's almost 6:30. You wanted to leave at 7. "Just fucking stay still," Remus groaned, straightening up and resting his hands on his hips. Sirius only huffed, looking every bit as ridiculous as he did, fucking fantastic, with only one eye's worth of eyeliner on. Clad in some ridiculous slacks and literally nothing else, he kicked a foot out, hitting Remus in the shin. Remus groaned, taking a step further back. "What's wrong with you? You keep doing that, and I'm not helping." "It doesn't have to be perfect," Sirius rolled his eyes. "Well then, why can't you do it?" "Because it's better when you do it." "I've never even done your eyeliner before." "Maybe I just want to be close to your face. Stare into those eyes," Sirius said slowly as he raised a brow, and Remus was in pain. "Just stay still." Remus finished the other eye quickly, roughly smudging it a bit, which was distracting. He tried his hardest not to think about his little moment in the shower not 10 minutes ago, and how now Sirius was staring into his eyes, because he had to. And when Remus finished, he took a hefty step back again, putting quite the distance between them. Because Sirius was in front of him on the bed, leaning back on his hands without a shirt on, and his pants weren't buttoned yet. He looked absolutely disheveled and taunting, and Remus wanted to leave the room, drive the truck back home, and never look Sirius in the eye again, because it was becoming harder, no pun intended, to ignore his massive and fucking ginormous feelings for the person in front of him. Not when he looked like that, and was looking at Remus like that. Sirius got up, checking in the mirror and grinning at himself. He turned to look at Remus, his gaze moving down, and Remus crossed his arms, a feeble attempt to hide from Sirius's prying eyes. Heaven forbid he pry too hard and find something Remus rather him not. That's what you're wearing? Remus glanced down at his jeans and shirt. It was nothing fancy, but he wasn't as much of a fancy dresser as Sirius was. Although he wagered you'd have to wear more than just pants to be considered a fashion icon. Sirius would decidedly disagree, and Remus would shut up then in order to keep his sanity and, thus, his thoughts and feelings to himself. I look bad? No, Sirius said quickly, squinting at Remus. No, I didn't mean that. Then what? You look nice. Nice? Remus grimaced, smoothing down the front of his shirt. You look great, Moons, Sirius said as he pulled on his boots, lacing the one up. I didn't mean anything by it. Remus only shrugged, grabbing the truck keys and his cigarettes before finding his flannel. He threw it on and turned in time to catch the tail end of a frown on Sirius's face. What? I was going to wear that. Remus looked down at the shirt, gauging how desperate it would come across if he took it off and insisted Sirius wear it. Wear it? No, Sirius would be nice, insisting it was fine. Remus would fall to his knees, begging, Please, just wear it so I can see you in my clothes, because sometimes I like to look over and see you smell my clothes. You don't know I know, but it brings me immense joy in this shit life I've been born into where I can't have what I so desperately want. Then Remus could wear it afterward, and it would probably smell like Sirius, and he was already starting to shrug it off. No falling to his knees, though. No begging. Just nonchalant indifference. No, Sirius insisted. It's fine. Remus paused before leaning over, grabbing his denim jacket from where it lay on the table. He tossed it to Sirius before heading to start the truck. Wear that. Remus took another sip of his beer, watching as Sirius returned from the jukebox, giving him a smile before sliding onto the stool next to him. A smile to melt your fucking brain, to make you doubt everything you ever knew in the fundamental laws of the universe. A smile that made you want to risk it all, to stand on top of the bar and yell and shout and fucking scream slam poetry and about the softness of skin and the warmth of the heart. About how those you love are a part of you. About how some people are special, and you smile because they smile, like they rip it out of you, and it's horrifying. How Remus felt himself fall harder every time Sirius so much as raised a brow, and how he wanted to bury himself into his heart and refuse to leave. Stake out until Sirius accepted his love. It was fucking sickening, and Remus took another sip of his beer. Sirius lit another cigarette, his long fingers reaching out and grabbing the nearest ashtray. Fingers Remus wanted to clasp in his own and never let go. Fingers that held Remus's fragile heart in them, and how even so much as a squeeze might throw him over the deep end. Please be careful, Remus wanted to say. I can't handle much more. I'm fragile. Please don't do it. Somewhere between getting in the truck and Sirius getting in, which was only about 2 minutes, Remus had decided to let loose tonight. Let loose was such a silly way to put it, he always thought, but he supposed that's what he was trying to do. Forget. Enjoy himself. Laugh a little. Whatever you want to call it. Which is something Sirius had been trying to get him to do his whole entire life. But it was hard when letting loose meant allowing yourself to fall in love with your best friend, which Remus had already done, so maybe he was way ahead of Sirius on that one, but he could never tell him. Maybe Remus had said fuck you to the world a long time ago when he had admitted his feelings for Sirius, but he had taken many a step back after that realization because it would do nothing but hurt the two of them. But Sirius was smiling at him, cheeks flushed, and he had sung to Remus on the drive there again, and it just seemed like something was in the air that night. Like something was telling him to fuck it all and have fun and let loose, and that was a dangerous game, but Remus was trying to play. So he let loose, whatever that really meant, and gave Sirius a smirk as he tilted his head back, finishing his beer before asking the bartender for another. One for me as well, please. Remus looked back and noticed a man and a woman leaning against the bar. Her arms were around his waist, and she was staring up at him with that same look, and Remus almost wanted to ask, "Does he melt your brain? Do you know any good poetry? Do you sometimes wish he was made of putty so you could just grab and squeeze and watch your fingerprints forever be impressed into his skin?" But he didn't. Remus only nodded at the man and gave him a slight smile. The woman tapped him on the arm, and the man looked at him before stretching his hand out. "Name's Frank," he smiled, and his girl had to know about the softness of skin and the warmth of the heart because he was handsome. A looker, if you will, and had Remus not been head over heels for the fool sat beside him, grumbling about his lighter going out, he would have given a bit more to the smile. Which was sad, because Remus was not so blind not to admire those in front of him. Many people who were hypothetically his type had stopped by the store when he worked, and he had seen many people in town that, maybe in another world, he would say, yeah, he'd do. But the problem lay with the fact that Sirius had always been in front of him, and long after he had left, Remus had never forgotten the shape of his smile or the sound of his laugh. All the different types of his laughs. The one where it was just a breath, an exhale, saved for when he was annoyed but couldn't help but laugh at Remus's joke anyway. There was the loud one, head thrown back, like whatever he was laughing about was giving him life. And Remus always joined in when Sirius laughed like that. There was the fake laugh, one of Remus's favorites, because if you knew Sirius, you saw right through it, and he was so damn charming most didn't. It was like a little secret, just between the two of them, and Remus coveted that. So, Frank was handsome, but not devastatingly so. So Remus only smiled, reaching into his pocket and sliding Sirius his extra lighter before shaking the man's hand. "Name's Remus. Nice to meet you." Frank squinted at him, glancing behind him as he dropped his hand. "Where you from?" "Texas," Remus said before he felt Sirius's body pressed against his back and turned, watching as Sirius leaned over his shoulder, stretching his open palm out to Frank. "Sirius." Frank laughed a bit, tilting his head. "Strange name." "An unfortunate name," Sirius corrected, glancing at Remus from the corner of his eye and blowing cigarette smoke in his face. Anyone else would have gotten a punch to the jaw, but Sirius? Remus only smiled. Let loose. He cleared his throat, looking back at Frank. "Where are you both from?" "Alabama. Birmingham, to be exact. But we'll be moving up north soon." Remus didn't know a thing about Alabama, not only because he had never been, but also because who knew anything about Alabama if you didn't live there? It was a southern state, though, and the southern hospitality kicked in somehow. "What are y'all doing here, then?" He nodded at the woman. "This is Alice." Frank kissed the top of her head, and Remus only nodded. What a pleasant display of affection. If Remus kissed the top of Sirius's head, Sirius was the type that would either bite him or make some suggestive joke, even though it was just an affection, and he couldn't deal with any more of those in his life. You'd think after sleeping next to the man and jerking off in the shower to him this morning, he'd be able to take a bit of sexual innuendo and dole them out, but those were kept under lock and key because Remus couldn't flirt, and he'd rather not just shout about wanting to fuck Sirius. Remus took another sip of his beer, smiling at the woman, and Frank grabbed his drink from the bar. "We're in town for the show tonight." Turns out there's a lot you can know about Alabama. The first rocket ever built was built there. The state bird is a yellow hammer. They're big fans of college football and peanuts, and apparently they have a snail problem, which seemed silly, and Remus had laughed, but supposedly it can be quite an issue. He learned all this during the walk from the old bar, conveniently named Frank's, and Sirius had laughed. Frank laughed too, but told them many places were named after his given name. The novelty had worn off long ago, to which Remus could not sympathize because his parents had hated him so much they gave him a name he would never be able to find on a tiny gas station keychains or Christmas ornaments. A joint was lit a few blocks away from the venue, and Remus watched as Frank sucked down about half of it before passing it around. Remus was floored, honestly, because he thought he smoked a lot and would overthink his coping mechanisms quite often after he was high, so Remus knew he did, but Frank only smiled and kept walking. Remus was already 3 beers deep on an almost empty stomach and didn't really feel like it was one of those nights. Still, then Sirius took a hit, turning to hand the joint to Remus, and blew the smoke in his face again. But this time it was closer. He was closer, and Sirius really just blew the smoke against his lips. And Sirius's shoulder bumped into his, and Remus took the joint with shaky hands. He took a long inhale, praying it tasted as good as it had a moment ago, but it hadn't, and Remus grimaced to himself, knowing that it had only been so sweet because it had come from Sirius's mouth. They stood in line for a bit, waiting to get to the ticket booth, and Remus was feeling it. Feeling it. He supposed the it was letting loose, having fun, and not caring. And it was nice, really, because friends were affectionate with each other, right? Friends wrapped their arms around one another, much like Remus had done to Sirius, and Sirius leaned his head against Remus's shoulder as a friend would. It was expected and acceptable, and had anyone questioned it, he would have given them strange a look and said, "What, we're just friends?" But Frank had given Remus a strange look, and then Alice had as they got their tickets. And Sirius removed his head from Remus's shoulder, and Alice's expression was like an answer to his question earlier. "It's not a poem, but have you read The Great Gatsby? Is he your Daisy? It would be a shame if you were Nick, huh? I get to press my fingers into him all the time. It's really lovely. I hope you get to do the same someday." Remus only blushed, looking away and stuffing his hands into his pockets as they made their way into the gates. The venue was large, but not too large. A handful of concessions were situated to their left when they entered, but the main stage was surrounded by a grassy field absolutely filled with people. Some had thrown blankets down, and some were standing, but it was a lot, and Remus was distinctly aware he had probably never been around this many people in his life. Remus had to pause, reminding himself that ordinary people enjoyed things like this and were used to stuff like this. He was one tiny person in a sea of people, and it was fine to let loose, and he had almost wanted to leave for the simple fact that it was just entirely overwhelming. But then Sirius had turned back to him with that smile on his face and grabbed Remus's hand and all but dragged them towards the stage. They found a spot near the front with the help of Sirius and Alice, who were very nicely telling people to move, which involved a lot of shoulders from Sirius, and he was right. It was fine. Remus went willingly into the sea of people being dragged along by Sirius. He was high, and the feel of Sirius's hand in his own, gripping so tightly as to not lose Remus, was a bit heavenly, even though it was hot outside, and his palm was sweating and mixing with Sirius's sweat, and Remus knew he had a fool's grin plastered across his face. Even if it killed him, he would be the biggest damn fool that night. They weren't entirely under the venue's canopy, and Frank lifted Alice onto his shoulders once they were there. Sirius was standing in front of Remus, pressed against his chest, and they were all sweating within minutes. But despite all the people crowding and surrounding them, he felt his world was tiny at that moment. On a whim of letting loose, Remus leaned his head on top of Sirius's, watching the lights dim on the stage, and he closed his eyes, blame it on being high, and turned to look at Alice. She gave him a small smile, glancing at Sirius's face before throwing her hands in the air as the first notes of "Song Remains the Same" rang out through the crowd. Remus would probably later liken it to seeing God. In some strange sense, he supposed that for those people who were not religious and those who were a fan of Led Zeppelin and who had also been there that night and seen Page play, it might have been God for all Remus knew. He had been raised in the church, kind of. His parents had always been one to preach the gospel and then whip around and turn a blind eye to their own hatred and justification. So Remus hadn't the faintest idea of what God could be or feel like, but he had been right. There was just something in the air that night, and it hadn't been just him. It was apparent in the absolute chaos surrounding him. It boxed all four of them in like they were granted their own little spot in the universe to just be in the moment, and Remus thought life couldn't get much better. The stage lights flickered in time with every note, and it was entirely too much for Remus to try and comprehend, so he just was. Sirius was in understandable awe and leaned back against Remus. His head was resting against his shoulder, his arms limped at his side, as everyone around them jumped and sang with the music, but he seemed oblivious to it all. Remus wasn't complaining. Sometime around the end of the first verse of Since I've Been Loving You, he had been only nodding as Plant somehow traveled through space and time. God, Remus was high, and somehow wormed his way into his brain and pulled and dug out all the awful feelings he was feeling.
Baby, since I've been loving you, yeah. I'm about to lose my worry mind.
Frank knocked on his shoulder, yelling something that Remus blindly nodded to. He felt a hand come up in front of him, and Sirius then, and it was another joint, and Remus watched how the light from the stage was obscured as Sirius took the joint between his fingers.
Everybody trying to tell me that it didn't make me so good. I've been trying. Lord, let me tell I really did the best I could.
The song knocked through Remus's brain, and he reached around and pressed his hands against Sirius's stomach, steadying him. He leaned down, resting his cheek on Sirius's shoulders, neither of them moving their gaze away from the stage, as Sirius held the joint up to Remus's lips, and he took a drag. And Remus licked his lips after, spending the following 2 songs thinking about how fucking tight Robert Plant's pants were, and how Sirius was dancing in front of him, but how he hadn't moved his body away from Remus's. Granted, there were a lot of people around, and maybe Sirius was just also really high. Still, as his ass had been dangerously close to Remus's cock for a good 30 minutes, and Remus was somehow able to push that thought out of his mind because he could hardly think as the intro to Stairway to Heaven came on, and the crowd completely lost it. Thousands of people were experiencing the same moment, but Remus knew each person was seeing it all from a different perspective. Each person had something to gain from that night, and each person there probably understood the idea of a common purpose and devotion at that moment. It was the strangest juxtaposition, the soft notes versus how the crowd immediately smushed even further into one another. And now Remus was looming over Sirius, full ass to dick, and listening to the sweet sound of Plant backtracking his sexual frustration and pent-up fucking awfully big feelings for the man in front of him. Remus turned and could see Frank and Alice to their left, somewhat farther away than they had been, and Remus almost laughed because it was just him and Sirius, as it had always been and always would be. Together, probably watching history unfold before them, and life was beautiful. He let loose, fucking made himself, because Sirius was doing whatever he fucking wanted, swaying in time with the music, and Remus needed a reprieve, because he felt the love so fucking hard at that moment he wanted to scream. He probably could have, along with everyone else, if he had been able to catch his breath. Remus glanced at the sage and watched as the lights went low.
And a new day will dawn for those who stand alone, and the forests will echo with laughter.
He leaned down terribly close to Sirius's ear and yelled over the music, "Get on my shoulders!" He felt Sirius look over, felt the drag of the shell of his ear against Remus's lips, and Sirius grinned. Now, Remus had never lifted someone on his shoulders and didn't even know where to begin, but Sirius scrambled anyway, shifting to stand behind him. Remus kneeled before him, helping and half pulling him up. "Don't drop me!" Sirius shouted, arms coming around his neck, and Remus grinned, leaning back a bit as he stood. He felt Sirius shriek as his arms tightened around his neck, his chin pressed against the top of his head. He stood, gripping the top of Sirius's thighs tightly, and shifted him a bit, so he was leaning forward. He heard Sirius yelp before laughing, and it was one of those fucking laughs, and it made Remus want to cry as he glanced up at Sirius.
If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alone there. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen.
Remus laughed freely, watching as Sirius's eyes lit up and his hair fell around his face and stuck to his skin, and he supposed if Paige was God, then maybe Sirius was an angel, because he certainly looked otherworldly in the light. Glinting off his sweat-slick skin, and his grin was so fucking wide, Sirius glanced down at Remus, still smiling like the world was his in front of him, and sang to Remus, hands pressed against his cheeks, glancing between him and the stage.
Your head is humming and it won't go, in case you don't know. The piper's calling you to join.
And it was everything Remus could have ever wanted, and something he thinks he would remember for the rest of his life. The pure and surreal and godly joy he felt at the moment. And time seemed to slow as Paige went into the guitar solo, and Remus lost all sense of self, and he felt selfish and angry and happy and overjoyed and every emotion he could ever possibly feel. So he gripped Sirius's thighs tighter and leaned into him, and then Plant started singing the bridge, and he finally got it. Sirius threw his hands up, leaning his hips into the back of Remus's neck, and it all just shifted a bit as Sirius's voice mixed in with the noise and the rest of the world. Remus was smiling like a madman, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that Sirius was his Daisy. And he dug his fingers into Sirius's skin, committing the moment to memory, and he pushed the heels of his palms into the sides of Sirius's thighs to try and make Sirius remember too. And Remus thought maybe it worked because he felt different, like there was no reason in the world that he couldn't have Sirius. After all, Sirius was there and smiling at him and singing to him, it seemed. It really did. And Remus thought maybe if he shouted, "I love you so fucking much," it would all click into place. But he couldn't even form words because the scene was just so picturesque. Unlike anything he thought he had ever had the pleasure of seeing. It beat out the Texas sunsets, the feeling of driving home later at night in the summer, smoking a cigarette after work. It beat the first time he heard Nashville Skyline and the Christmas he woke up as he walked outside to a new, to him, car. It beat pretty much every moment in his miserable life up until that moment, and maybe that was the God in the air that night. The feeling of being so far from home, but like you had everything you needed with you, so you were never too far from where you belonged. Plant's voice carried through the venue. Sirius was grinning, and Remus was delighted. For a brief moment, as the ending notes of the song played, he felt like a god, and that was just an absurd thing to feel. Still, he felt like he could do anything, had the power to have whatever he wanted. And it had been a long time since he had been to church, but Remus thought if he explained the feeling to someone who had recently been, maybe they would tell him that, yes, it had to have been something holy that he was feeling right then. "Marry Neil?" Frank asked, lighting another joint. "Yeah," Remus laughed. "This little shit stain of a town, west of Dallas a bit." "Sounds awful." "Oh, it is," he grimaced, taking a drag of his cigarette before tossing it on the ground and smushing it with his boot. They both moved up in line, and Remus knocked elbows with Frank and muttered an apology. They had been waiting in line for beer for the last 15 minutes because after Stairway to Heaven had ended, Sirius had just so sweetly leaned down in front of Remus's face, and his hair had created some sort of fucking curtain. Remus was just so enthralled with it all that when Sirius had asked for a beer, he had said, of course. So they stood in line, muttering apologies as those around them moved about, doing whatever they needed to do during the break. And it was a lot of people, but Remus was okay with it now. He took another drag of the joint before passing it back to Frank, and he thought he had never been this high in his life, and it was great. He missed Sirius, though, and his face, and just wanting to stare at his face. Remus hoped maybe one day he could freeze time and spend a good week just staring. He just wanted to stare and admire and think lovely thoughts and really catalog everything he loved about Sirius. Remus thought that he deserved that. He deserved that moment, and Sirius was worthy of cataloging and staring. They grabbed the beers, which were a handful to carry, and Remus was a bit slow with his reflexes at the moment, but collectively they managed. They got halfway back to the stage when Remus heard Frank curse, and he followed his line of sight to the sky, where, despite it being dark out, he could see the heavy clouds looming over them. "If it rains, we can't smoke," Frank said, staring blankly at the sky still, beers in hand, as if they hadn't already smoked enough. Remus wasn't sure he could get any higher. But he nodded at the same time they heard the feedback of a guitar, and a moment later, as both he and Frank turned towards the stage, the beginning notes of 10 Years Gone rang out through California that night, and Remus felt his shoulders drop at the melody. They only stood there, frozen in time, it seemed, as people rushed past them to get back to the stage. Stock still in the crowd of people, Remus wondered if Frank was also thinking of the one he loved. If he had ever listened to this song and cried so hard you were left with nothing inside of you but sniffles and tiredness that sank into your bones. A crack of thunder echoed over them, and Frank looked at Remus finally. "We'll wait it out in the back, smoke, then find them." Remus nodded, following behind him.
As it was, then again it will be. Though the course may change sometimes, rivers always reach the sea.
They weaved their way through the crowd, trying their hardest not to drop or spill any of the beer along the way, and finally made it to a spot near the back. They scanned the crowd for Sirius and Alice, but neither could find them.
Fine skies of fortune, each have separate ways. On the wings of maybe, downy birds of prey.
Remus sank down onto the grass, watching as a few people walked past them, laughing and joking and listening to the song and enjoying it. And Remus was enjoying it, but he was also acutely aware of how much he fucking hated this song. He loved it, but hated it.
Change has spilled my time. Baby, that's alright with me. In the midst, I think of you and how it used to be.
It was a visceral reaction, and Remus limply took the joint from Frank's hand as he slid down to sit next to him, resting the beers in the grass between them. Trying to get higher, but he feels like he had hit a plateau. Remus took a drag, well past the point in the evening where he cared about much other than the next few moments, which were filled with a bit of spiraling as the carefree and letting go-ness of the evening collided with full-blown "what the fuck are you doing?" Could it be the best love he'd ever had if it was only from him? If Sirius didn't love him back? Like that? Remus had a pained look on his face as he spoke to God at that moment, which was decidedly Robert Plant, and he thought maybe if he actually talked to him, stopped the concert to have a one-on-one and ask Plant, "What the fuck am I doing?" then perhaps he could figure it out, because Remus sure as hell didn't know. He passed the joint back to Frank, who leaned into him. You ever try? What? He shouted over the music. Remus could barely hear him. He drew his eyes away from the stage. Frank nodded towards the general direction of Sirius and Alice, who Remus could see now. They were dancing together, Sirius spinning Alice around, and she was laughing, and Sirius was grinning, and it was a wonderful sight, but Remus wished it were him. He felt so selfish at that thought because it was all fun anyway. With him, Frank gestured to the two of them, and Remus paused, taking a deep breath. He spoke freely, for the first time in his life. I don't know if I've tried too hard or not at all, really. And then another crack of thunder rang out over the ending notes to the song, and a moment later, Remus felt a raindrop hit his arm. He glanced up, watching as the skies opened up, and it was a horrifying display of the ways of the universe. The rain began to fall, and people started shouting as the song faded out, and Remus watched as the joint got rained on, sizzling out in front of him. He nodded to himself, understanding the feeling as he glanced at Sirius again, who was spinning Alice around, dancing in the rain. Head thrown back, smile wide, Remus was high enough to where he did feel like his face and brain melted at the sight because he wanted that to be him Sirius was looking at like that and dancing with. Remus didn't know if he had it in him, if he would ever truly be able to be that carefree and in love with the world, but he stood anyway as Frank did. And then it began to rain even harder, and a handful of things happened at once, like a fucking movie, and as if a moment in Remus's life wasn't nice enough to be in a film. It was all slow motion. Sirius tilted his head back again, hair sticking to his face, as Remus and Frank made their way over to them. He let out a laugh, and Remus could hear it right before the opening notes to Tangerine began, and the crowd went into a fucking frenzy as Sirius reached, took off his soaked jacket, and threw it on the ground next to him. Remus's heart dropped to his stomach, his mind filled with moments in his room alone, trying his hardest to play the song because it always reminded him of Sirius. If Sirius were a song, he would be that song. Don't ask why or how, but it just was. And Remus was there, a bitter taste in his mouth as those around Sirius seemed closer to him than he ever could be. Sometimes, being a stranger was an art form. Seeing someone for what they are, not what they're made of. And Remus knew all of Sirius's insides. Knew what he was made of, but also how he looked in the morning. Knew every single tiny bit of things there was to know about Sirius. And it piled up between them, creating space. They walked closer, and it was all too much in a horrible way, because Sirius was something else entirely. Too big for this world, and too kind, and too good. And Remus was just Remus. And he was a sad sack of shit in love with someone so grand that he could never grasp on and hold him and keep him. He would try his hardest if he ever got the chance, but Remus could never be that as he looked at the way Sirius fell to the ground, arms out wide, and just let the rain fall over him. He was the epitome of happiness at that moment, and Remus was jealous, wishing he knew what it was like. Sirius's hips came up, and he shook his head again, Alice looking down at him, and she was smiling too, and they painted the most idyllic picture in the world. And then for a second time that night, things shifted, slowed down even more, because Sirius looked over and met his gaze. And the biggest fucking smile was on his face. Fucking huge. All teeth and rosy cheeks.
To think of us again.
He was grinning when he looked at Remus, but as Remus came to stand in front of him and Sirius saw him, it got even brighter, and his eyes fucking twinkled and lit up, and the pure joy on his face made Remus's heart almost burst because he was smiling at him like that. Looking up at him like he swore, Remus hung the moon.
And I do.
And it was all worth it as Sirius lunged for him, jumping to his feet. Remus tried to set the beers down on the grass carefully, but knew they fell over as Sirius wrapped his arms around Remus's neck, and Remus was soaked from the rain, and Sirius's chest pressed his damp shirt into his skin, and his socks were drenched, but none of that mattered. Sirius rocked them back and forth, something careless, and every single bad and awful thought that was just gone. And Remus felt foolish and silly for thinking anything other than this person was worth it. He's my person, and he is worth it all. Every last bit. And for his final letting go of the night, Remus wrapped his arms around Sirius. He spun him in a circle, watching as Sirius tilted his head back again, letting the rain fall on his face, and it was captivating and beautiful, and everything was fine in the world as the shifted pieces finally settled into place.